Chapter 23 of Northanger Abbey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen, Chapter 23. An hour passed away before the General came in, spent, on the part of his young guest, in no very favourable consideration of his character.
This lengthened absence, these solitary rambles, did not speak a mind at ease or a conscience void of reproach.
At length he appeared, and whatever might have been the gloom of his meditations, he could still smile with them. Miss Tilney, understanding in part her friend's curiosity to see the house, soon revived the subject, and her father being, contrary to Catherine's expectations, unprovided with any pretence for further delay, beyond that of stopping 5 minutes to order refreshments to be in the room by their return, was at last ready to escort them. They set forward, and with a grandeur of air, a dignified step which caught the eye, but could not shake the doubts of the well-read Catherine, he led the way across the hall, through the common drawing-room, and one useless antechamber, into a room magnificent both in size and furniture, the real drawing-room, used only with company of consequence. It was
very noble, very grand, very charming,
was all that Catherine had to say, for her indiscriminating eye scarcely discerned the colour of the satin, and all minuteness of praise, all praise that had much meaning, was supplied by the General. The costliness or elegance of any room's fitting up could be nothing to her. She cared for no furniture of a more modern date than the 15th century. When the General had satisfied his own curiosity in a close examination of every well-known ornament, they proceeded into the library, an apartment, in its way, of equal magnificence, exhibiting a collection of books on which an humble man might have looked with pride. Catherine heard, admired, and wondered with more genuine feeling than before, gathered all that she could from this storehouse of knowledge by running over the titles of half a shelf, and was ready to proceed. But suites of apartments did not spring up with her wishes. Large as was the building, she had already visited the greatest part, though on being told that with the addition of the kitchen, the 6 or 7 rooms she had now seen surrounded 3 sides of the court, she could scarcely believe it, or overcome the suspicion of there being many chambers secreted. It was some relief, however, that they were to return to the rooms in common use, by passing through a few of less importance, looking into the court, which, with occasional passages, not wholly unintricate, connected the different sides, and she was further soothed in her progress by being told that
she was treading what had once been a cloister,
having traces of cells pointed out, and observing several doors that were neither opened nor explained to her, by finding herself successively in a billiard-room and in the General's private apartment without comprehending their connection, or being able to turn aright when she left them, and lastly by passing through a dark little room, owning Henry's authority, and strewed with his litter of books, guns, and greatcoats. From the dining-room, of which, though already seen, and always to be seen at 5 o'clock, the General could not forego the pleasure of pacing out the length, for the more certain information of Miss Morland, as to what she neither doubted nor cared for, they proceeded by quick communication to the kitchen. The ancient kitchen of the convent, rich in the massy walls and smoke of former days, and in the stoves and hot closets of the present. The General's improving hand had not loitered here.
Every modern invention to facilitate the labour of the cooks had been adopted within this, their spacious theatre, and when the genius of others had failed, his own had often produced the perfection wanted. His endowments of this spot alone might at any time have placed him high among the benefactors of the convent.
With the walls of the kitchen ended all the antiquity of the abbey, the 4th side of the quadrangle having, on account of its decaying state, been removed by the General's father, and the present erected in its place. All that was venerable ceased here. The new building was not only new, but declared itself to be so, intended only for offices, and enclosed behind by stable-yards. No uniformity of architecture had been thought necessary. Catherine could have raved at the hand which had swept away what must have been beyond the value of all the rest, for the purposes of mere domestic economy, and would willingly have been spared the mortification of a walk through scenes so fallen, had the General allowed it, but
If he had a vanity, it was in the arrangement of his offices.
And he was convinced that,
to a mind like Miss Morland's, a view of the accommodations and comforts, by which the labours of her inferiors were softened, must always be gratifying.
he should make no apology for leading her on. They took a slight survey of all, and Catherine was impressed beyond her expectation by their multiplicity and their convenience. The purposes for which a few shapeless pantries and a comfortless scullery were deemed sufficient at Fullerton were here carried on in appropriate divisions, commodious and roomy. The number of servants continually appearing did not strike her less than the number of their offices. Wherever they went, some patterned girl stopped to curtsy, or some footman in dishabille sneaked off. Yet this was an abbey. How inexpressibly different in these domestic arrangements from such as she had read about, from abbeys and castles, in which, though certainly larger than Northanger, all the dirty work of the house was to be done by 2 pair of female hands at the utmost. How they could get through it all had often amazed Mrs. Allen, and when Catherine saw what was necessary here, she began to be amazed herself. They returned to the hall, that the chief staircase might be ascended, and the beauty of its wood and ornaments of rich carving might be pointed out. Having gained the top, they turned in an opposite direction from the gallery in which her room lay, and shortly entered one on the same plan, but superior in length and breadth. She was here shown successively into 3 large bedchambers, with their dressing-rooms most completely and handsomely fitted up, everything that money and taste could do to give comfort and elegance to apartments had been bestowed on these, and being furnished within the last 5 years, they were perfect in all that would be generally pleasing, and wanting in all that could give pleasure to Catherine. As they were surveying the last, after slightly naming a few of the distinguished characters by whom they had at times been honoured, turned with a smiling countenance to Catherine, and ventured to
hope that henceforward some of their earliest tenants might be our friends from Fullerton.
She felt the unexpected compliment, and deeply regretted the impossibility of thinking well of a man so kindly disposed towards herself, and so full of civility to all her family. The gallery was terminated by folding doors, which Miss Tilney, advancing, had thrown open, and passed through, and seemed on the point of doing the same by the first door to the left, in another long reach of gallery, when the General, coming forwards, called her hastily, and, as Catherine thought, rather angrily back, demanding
whither she were going, and what was there more to be seen? Had not Miss Morland already seen all that could be worth her notice? And did she not suppose her friend might be glad of some refreshment after so much exercise?
Miss Tilney drew back directly, and the heavy doors were closed upon the mortified Catherine, who, having seen in a momentary glance beyond them a narrower passage, more numerous openings, and symptoms of a winding staircase, believed herself at last within the reach of something worth her notice, and felt as she unwillingly paced back the gallery that she would rather be allowed to examine that end of the house than see all the finery of all the rest. The General's evident desire of preventing such an examination was an additional stimulant. Something was certainly to be concealed. Her fancy, though it had trespassed lately once or twice, could not mislead her here. And what that something was, a short sentence of Miss Tilney's, as they followed the General at some distance downstairs, seemed to point out.
"I was going to take you into what was my mother's room, the room in which she died,"
were all her words. But few as they were, they conveyed pages of intelligence to Catherine. It was no wonder that the General should shrink from the sight of such objects as that room must contain, a room in all probability never entered by him since the dreadful scene had passed, which released his suffering wife, and left him to the stings of conscience. She ventured, when next alone with Eleanor, to express a wish of being permitted to see it, as well as all the rest of that side of the house, and Eleanor promised to attend her there whenever they should have a convenient hour. Catherine understood her. The General must be watched from home before that room could be entered.
"It remains as it was, I suppose?"
said she, in a tone of feeling.
"Yes, entirely."
"And how long ago may it be that your mother died?"
She has been dead these 9 years.
And 9 years, Catherine knew, was a trifle of time compared with what generally elapsed after the death of an injured wife before her room was put to rights.
You were with her, I suppose, to the last?
No.
Said Miss Tilney, sighing.
I was unfortunately from home. Her illness was sudden and short, and before I arrived, it was all over.
Catherine's blood ran cold with the horrid suggestions which naturally sprang from these words.
Could it be possible? Could Henry's father? And yet how many were the examples to justify even the blackest suspicions?
And when she saw him in the evening, while she worked with her friend, slowly pacing the drawing-room for an hour together in silent thoughtfulness, with downcast eyes and contracted brow, she felt secure from all possibility of wronging him.
It was the air and attitude of a Montoni. What could more plainly speak the gloomy workings of a mind not wholly dead to every sense of humanity in its fearful review of past scenes of guilt? Unhappy man!
And the anxiousness of her spirits directed her eyes toward his figure so repeatedly as to catch Miss Tilney's notice.
My father,
she whispered,
often walks about the room in this way. It is nothing unusual.
So much the worse,
thought Catherine. Such ill-timed exercise was of a piece with the strange unseasonableness of his morning walks, and boded nothing good. After an evening, the little variety and seeming length of which made her peculiarly sensible of Henry's importance among them, she was heartily glad to be dismissed, though it was a look from the General not designed for her observation, which sent his daughter to the bell. When the butler would have lit his master's candle, however, he was forbidden. The latter was not going to retire.
"I have many pamphlets to finish,"
said he to Catherine,
"before I can close my eyes, and perhaps may be poring over the affairs of the nation for hours after you are asleep. Can either of us be more meetly employed? My eyes will be blinding for the good of others, and yours preparing, by rest, for future mischief."
But neither the business alleged nor the magnificent compliment could win Catherine from thinking that some very different object must occasion so serious a delay of proper repose.
To be kept up for hours after the family were in bed by stupid pamphlets was not very likely. There must be some deeper cause. Something was to be done which could be done only while the household slept.
And the probability that Mrs. Tilney yet lived, shut up for causes unknown, and receiving from the pitiless hand of her husband a nightly supply of coarse food, was the conclusion which necessarily followed. Shocking as was the idea, it was at least better than a death unfairly hastened, as in the natural course of things she must ere long be released.
The suddenness of her reputed illness, the absence of her daughter, and probably of her other children, at the time all favoured the supposition of her imprisonment. Its origin, jealousy perhaps, or wanton cruelty, was yet to be unravelled.
In revolving these matters while she undressed, it suddenly struck her as not unlikely that she might that morning have passed near the very spot of this unfortunate woman's confinement, might have been within a few paces of the cell in which she languished out her days. For what part of the abbey could be more fitted for the purpose than that which yet bore the traces of monastic division? In the high arched passage paved with stone, which already she had trodden with peculiar awe, she well remembered the doors of which the General had given no account.
To what might not those doors lead?
In support of the plausibility of this conjecture, it further occurred to her that the forbidden gallery, in which lay the apartments of the unfortunate Mrs. Tilney, must be, as certainly as her memory could guide her exactly, over this suspected range of cells, and the staircase by the side of those apartments, of which she had caught a transient glimpse, communicating by some secret means with those cells, might well have favoured the barbarous proceedings of her husband.
Down that staircase she had perhaps been conveyed in a state of well-prepared insensibility.
Catherine sometimes started at the boldness of her own surmises, and sometimes hoped or feared that she had gone too far, but they were supported by such appearances as made their dismissal impossible. The side of the quadrangle in which she supposed the guilty scene to be acting being, according to her belief, just opposite her own, it struck her that if judiciously watched, some rays of light from the General's lamp might glimmer through the lower windows as he passed to the prison of his wife. And twice before she stepped into bed she stole gently from her room to the corresponding window in the gallery to see if it appeared. But all abroad was dark, and it must yet be too early. The various ascending noises convinced her that the servants must still be up.
Till midnight,
She supposed.
it would be in vain to watch. But then, when the clock had struck 12 and all was quiet, she would, if not quite appalled by darkness, steal out and look once more.
The clock struck 12, and Catherine had been half an hour asleep. End of chapter 23.
Chapter 24 of Northanger Abbey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. Chapter 24. The next day afforded no opportunity for the proposed examination of the mysterious apartments. It was Sunday, and the whole time between morning and afternoon service was required by the General in exercise abroad, or eating cold meat at home. And great as was Catherine's curiosity, her courage was not equal to a wish of exploring them after dinner, either by the fading light of the sky between 6 and 7 o'clock, or by the yet more partial though stronger illumination of a treacherous lamp. The day was unmarked, therefore, by anything to interest her imagination, beyond the sight of a very elegant monument to the memory of Mrs. Tilney, which immediately fronted the family pew. By that her eye was instantly caught, and long retained, and the perusal of the highly strained epitaph, in which every virtue was ascribed to her by the inconsolable husband, who must have been in some way or other her destroyer, affected her even to tears. That the General, having erected such a monument, should be able to face it, was not perhaps very strange, and yet that he could sit so boldly collected within its view, maintain so elevated an air, look so fearlessly around, nay, that he should even enter the church, seemed wonderful to Catherine. Not, however, that many instances of beings equally hardened in guilt might not be produced.
She could remember dozens who had persevered in every possible vice, going on from crime to crime, murdering whomsoever they chose, without any feeling of humanity or remorse, till a violent death or religious retirement closed their black career.
The erection of the monument itself could not in the smallest degree affect her doubts of Mrs. Tilney's actual decease. Were she even to descend into the family vault where her ashes were supposed to slumber, were she to behold the coffin in which they were said to be enclosed, what could it avail in such a case? Catherine had read too much not to be perfectly aware of the ease with which a waxen figure might be introduced and a supposititious funeral carried on. The succeeding morning promised something better. The General's early walk, ill-timed as it was in every other view, was favourable here, and when she knew him to be out of the house, she directly proposed to Miss Tilney the accomplishment of her promise. Eleanor was ready to oblige her, and Catherine reminding her as they went of another promise, their first visit in consequence was to the portrait in her bedchamber. It represented a very lovely woman, with a mild and pensive countenance, justifying so far the expectations of its new observer. But they were not in every respect answered, for Catherine had depended upon meeting with features, hair, complexion, that should be the very counterpart, the very image, if not of Henry's, of Eleanor's, the only portraits of which she had been in the habit of thinking, bearing always an equal resemblance of mother and child. A face once taken was taken for generations. But here she was obliged to look and consider and study for a likeness. She contemplated it, however, in spite of this drawback, with much emotion, and, but for a yet stronger interest, would have left it unwillingly. Her agitation as they entered the great gallery was too much for any endeavour at discourse. She could only look at her companion. Eleanor's countenance was dejected, yet sedate, and its composure spoke her inured to all the gloomy objects to which they were advancing. Again she passed through the folding doors, again her hand was upon the important lock, and Catherine, hardly able to breathe, was turning to close the former with fearful caution, when the figure, the dreaded figure of the General himself at the further end of the gallery stood before her. The name of
Eleanor,
at the same moment in his loudest tone, resounded through the building, giving to his daughter the first intimation of his presence, and to Catherine terror upon terror. An attempt at concealment had been her first instinctive movement on perceiving him, yet she could scarcely hope to have escaped his eye, and when her friend, who with an apologizing look darted hastily by her, had joined and disappeared with him, she ran for safety to her own room, and locking herself in, believed that she should never have courage to go down again. She remained there at least an hour, in the greatest agitation, deeply commiserating the state of her poor friend, and expecting a summons herself from the angry General to attend him in his own apartment. No summons, however, arrived, and at last, on seeing a carriage drive up to the Abbey, she was emboldened to descend and meet him under the protection of visitors. The breakfast-room was gay with company, and she was named to them by the General as
the friend of his daughter,
in a complimentary style, which so well concealed his resentful ire as to make her feel secure at least of life for the present. And Eleanor, with a command of countenance which did honour to her concern for his character, taking an early occasion of saying to her,
"My father only wanted me to answer a note,"
she began to hope that she had either been unseen by the General, or that from some consideration of policy she should be allowed to suppose herself so. Upon this trust she dared still to remain in his presence, after the company left them, and nothing occurred to disturb it. In the course of this morning's reflections, she came to a resolution of making her next attempt on the forbidden door alone.
It would be much better in every respect that Eleanor should know nothing of the matter, to involve her in the danger of a second detection, to court her into an apartment which must wring her heart, could not be the office of a friend. The General's utmost anger could not be to herself what it might be to a daughter, and besides, she thought the examination itself would be more satisfactory if made without any companion.
It would be impossible to explain to Eleanor the suspicions from which the other had, in all likelihood, been hitherto happily exempt, nor could she therefore, in her presence, search for those proofs of the General's cruelty, which, however they might yet have escaped discovery, she felt confident of somewhere drawing forth, in the shape of some fragmented journal, continued to the last gasp. Of the way to the apartment she was now perfectly mistress, and as she wished to get it over before Henry's return, who was expected on the morrow, there was no time to be lost. The day was bright, her courage high. At 4 o'clock the sun was now 2 hours above the horizon, and it would be only her retiring to dress half an hour earlier than usual. It was done, and Catherine found herself alone in the gallery before the clocks had ceased to strike. It was no time for thought. She hurried on, slipped with the least possible noise through the folding doors, and without stopping to look or breathe, rushed forward to the one in question. The lock yielded to her hand, and luckily with no sullen sound that could alarm a human being. On tiptoe she entered. The room was before her, but it was some minutes before she could advance another step. She beheld what fixed her to the spot and agitated every feature. She saw a large, well-proportioned apartment, an handsome dimity bed, arranged as unoccupied with a housemaid's care, a bright bath stove, mahogany wardrobes, and neatly painted chairs, on which the warm beams of a western sun gaily poured through 2 sash windows. Catherine had expected to have her feelings worked, and worked they were. Astonishment and doubt first seized them, and a shortly succeeding ray of common sense added some bitter emotions of shame.
She could not be mistaken as to the room, but how grossly mistaken in everything else, in Miss Tilney's meaning, in her own calculation.
This apartment, to which she had given a date so ancient, a position so awful, proved to be one end of what the General's father had built. There were 2 other doors in the chamber, leading probably into dressing-closets, but she had no inclination to open either.
Would the veil in which Mrs. Tilney had last walked, or the volume in which she had last read, remain to tell what nothing else was allowed to whisper? No, whatever might have been the General's crimes, he had certainly too much wit to let them sue for detection.
She was sick of exploring, and desired but to be safe in her own room, with her own heart only privy to its folly, and she was on the point of retreating as softly as she had entered, when the sound of footsteps, she could hardly tell where, made her pause and tremble. To be found there, even by a servant, would be unpleasant, but by the General, and he seemed always at hand when least wanted, much worse. She listened, the sound had ceased, and resolving not to lose a moment, she passed through and closed the door. At that instant a door underneath was hastily opened. Someone seemed with swift steps to ascend the stairs, by the head of which she had yet to pass before she could gain the gallery. She had no power to move. With a feeling of terror not very definable, she fixed her eyes on the staircase, and in a few moments it gave Henry to her view.
"Mr. Tilney!"
she exclaimed in a voice of more than common astonishment. He looked astonished too.
"Good God!"
she continued, not attending to his address.
"How came you here? How came you up that staircase?"
"How came I up that staircase?"
he replied, greatly surprised.
"Because it is my nearest way from the stable yard to my own chamber. And why should I not come up it?"
Catherine recollected herself, blushed deeply, and could say no more. He seemed to be looking in her countenance for that explanation which her lips did not afford. She moved on towards the gallery.
"And may I not, in my turn,"
said he as he pushed back the folding doors,
"ask how you came here? This passage is at least as extraordinary a road from the breakfast parlour to your apartment as that staircase can be from the stables to mine."
"I have been,"
said Catherine, looking down,
"to see your mother's room."
"My mother's room? Is there anything extraordinary to be seen there?"
"No, nothing at all. I thought you did not mean to come back till tomorrow."
"I did not expect to be able to return sooner when I went away, but 3 hours ago I had the pleasure of finding nothing to detain me. You look pale. I am afraid I alarmed you by running so fast up those stairs. Perhaps you did not know. You were not aware of their leading from the offices in common use."
"No, I was not. You have had a very fine day for your ride."
"Very. And does Eleanor leave you to find your way into all the rooms in the house by yourself?"
"Oh, no, she showed me over the greatest part on Saturday, and we were coming here to these rooms, but only—"
dropping her voice,
"your father was with us."
"And that prevented you?"
said Henry, earnestly regarding her.
"Have you looked into all the rooms in that passage?"
"No, I only wanted to see. Is it not very late? I must go and dress."
"It is only 4:15.
showing his watch.
And you are not now in Bath. No theatre, no rooms to prepare for. Half an hour at Northanger must be enough."
She could not contradict it, and therefore suffered herself to be detained, though her dread of further questions made her, for the first time in their acquaintance, wish to leave him. They walked slowly up the gallery.
"Have you had any letter from Bath since I saw you?"
"No, and I am very much surprised. Isabella promised so faithfully to write directly."
"Promised so faithfully. A faithful promise. That puzzles me. I have heard of a faithful performance, but a faithful promise, the fidelity of promising. It is a power little worth knowing, however, since it can deceive and pain you. My mother's room is very commodious, is it not? Large and cheerful looking, and the dressing closet so well disposed. It always strikes me as the most comfortable apartment in the house, and I rather wonder that Eleanor should not take it for her own. She sent you to look at it, I suppose?"
"No."
"It has been your own doing entirely?"
Catherine said nothing. After a short silence, during which he had closely observed her, he added,
"As there is nothing in the room itself to raise curiosity, this must have proceeded from a sentiment of respect for my mother's character, as described by Eleanor, which does honour to her memory. The world, I believe, never saw a better woman. But it is not often that virtue can boast an interest such as this. The domestic, unpretending merits of a person never known do not often create that kind of fervent, venerating tenderness which would prompt a visit like yours. Eleanor, I suppose, has talked of her a great deal?"
"Yes, a great deal. That is, no, not much, but what she did say was very interesting. Her dying so suddenly."
Slowly and with hesitation it was spoken.
"And you... none of you being at home, and your father, I thought, perhaps had not been very fond of her.
And from these circumstances,
he replied, his quick eye fixed on hers.
you infer perhaps the probability of some negligence, some...
Involuntarily she shook her head.
Or it may be of something still less pardonable.
She raised her eyes towards him more fully than she had ever done before.
My mother's illness,
He continued.
the seizure which ended in her death, was sudden. The malady itself, one from which she had often suffered, a bilious fever, its cause therefore constitutional. On the third day, in short, as soon as she could be prevailed on, a physician attended her, a very respectable man, and one in whom she had always placed great confidence. Upon his opinion of her danger, 2 others were called in the next day, and remained in almost constant attendance for 24 hours. On the 5th day she died. During the progress of her disorder, Frederick and I, we were both at home, saw her repeatedly, and from our own observation can bear witness to her having received every possible attention which could spring from the affection of those about her, or which her situation in life could command. Poor Eleanor was absent, and at such a distance as to return only to see her mother in her coffin.
But your father,
Said Catherine.
was he afflicted?
For a time greatly so. You have erred in supposing him not attached to her. He loved her, I am persuaded, as well as it was possible for him to. We have not all, you know, the same tenderness of disposition, and I will not pretend to say that while she lived she might not often have had much to bear. But though his temper injured her, his judgment never did. His value of her was sincere, and, if not permanently, he was truly afflicted by her death.
I am very glad of it.
Said Catherine.
It would have been very shocking.
If I understand you rightly, you had formed a surmise of such horror as I have hardly words to... Dear Miss Morland, consider the dreadful nature of the suspicions you have entertained. What have you been judging from? Remember the country and the age in which we live. Remember that we are English, that we are Christians. Consult your own understanding, your own sense of the probable, your own observation of what is passing around you. Does our education prepare us for such atrocities? Do our laws connive at them? Could they be perpetrated without being known, in a country like this, where social and literary intercourse is on such a footing, where every man is surrounded by a neighbourhood of voluntary spies, and where roads and newspapers lay everything open? Dearest Miss Morland, what ideas have you been admitting?
They had reached the end of the gallery, and with tears of shame, she ran off to her own room. End of chapter 24.